Okay, so the last part of this chapter on the cell membrane is about cells communicating with one another. And we're going to talk specifically about multicellular or cell communication. Although it does occur in single-celled organisms, they can also communicate with one another. So in eukaryotic organisms, I guess the most local of all cell signaling would be where cells are actually connected to each other and they share their cytoplasm. So we see this in plasmodesmata, which was the way that plant cells could be connected to each other. And in animal cells, these were called gap junctions, which were very similar, or at least what they did was similar, which was that the cytoplasm could actually flow in between the two and they could communicate with one another. Now, in most cases, though, if we're not talking about the cells being directly connected, we can have local signaling, meaning that the cell is sending a message to a cell that's very close to it. So the first kind of local signaling that we're going to talk about is called paracrine signaling, and para means like side by side. And what we see in paracrine signaling is that a cell is basically sending out a message, here you see it, where it secretes something, and these are the target cells that are right nearby around it. So it's a local regulator, something that just goes through the extracellular fluid. The next kind we're going to talk about is called synaptic signaling. This is specifically in the nervous system, where the cell releases, or the end of one neuron releases what's called a neurotransmitter. And the neurotransmitter is a chemical that goes across this area called the synapse and stimulates either the next nerve, or this could be going to a muscle, this could be going to the brain, wherever this is going. And so that's also local, but it has a special name. And lastly, this one you've learned about before probably, the endocrine system. Endocrine cells basically secrete hormones. Hormones travel through the bloodstream, and they're usually going to a target cell that may be very, very far away from the original cell producing the hormone. Okay, so this slide in particular is just talking about the nervous system. In animal cells, this is synaptic signaling. This is where literally you have a nerve, it carries an impulse, and that's usually facilitated by an electrochemical gradient. The whole idea with the ion channels opening, sodium flows in, the sodium-potassium pump is involved in all of this and maintaining this. But when the impulse gets to the end of a nerve, it can't jump to the next nerve. That's sort of like electricity jumping out of the wall. There's got to be a way for it to get to the next nerve. The way that happens is by neurotransmitters. So it literally travels down. When it gets to the end, it gets to here to the synapse. This is called the space between the synapse. And what you see is that it now releases a chemical which is called a neurotransmitter, and that stimulates the next nerve. So it travels like an electrical signal down the nerve, but when it gets to the end, it pushes these buttons, you can almost imagine, that release a neurotransmitter, which is now a chemical, either stimulating the next nerve, stimulating the brain, stimulating a muscle, wherever that neuron is whatever its target is. Some examples of this would be, a really good example of this is like in your brain you have serotonin. Serotonin is a particular neurotransmitter that stimulates cells of your brain that cause you to feel pleasure. In depression, a lot of times what the problem is that the synapse here, the electrical signal travels along the nerve, but when it gets to the end here, serotonin is supposed to be released, and it is. But the problem is this now takes it back up again, because anytime this is released into the synapse, these need to be recycled, or the next nerve would just be stimulated forever and ever and ever. So this needs to be reabsorbed. In some cases, it gets reabsorbed too quickly, and so one of the treatments for depression, one of the major classes of drugs used to treat depression are SSRIs, which are basically serotonin reuptake inhibitors. In other words, they slow down how quickly this neuron ends here, how quickly it picks the neurotransmitter back up, so that the neurotransmitter, the serotonin, has enough time to actually stimulate the cells in the brain. Another example of this would be with like neurotoxins in snakes. A lot of them either mimic neurotransmitters, so they stimulate the next neuron and cause you to have paralysis. They may be blockers that prevent this neuron from releasing, or bind to and prevent the neurotransmitter from stimulating the next neuron. So there's a lot of ways that toxins are involved with neurotransmitters. All right, and then long distance, I mentioned this, are hormones. Hormones are actually not just in animals. In animals, they specifically travel through the blood, which is a little different. How in plants, they can travel in different ways. Sometimes even hormones are released as gases in plants. Like ethylene is a hormone that literally makes a plant, makes the fruit get ripe. But in us, these hormones are released and travel through the blood. Okay, we're not going to learn huge details about any of this stuff. There's some main things I want you to know. Number one, I want you to know those 3 different types of signaling. There was the paracrine, which was right nearby. There was the synapse, which was specifically in nerves. And then there's hormonal, the long distance signaling, and that's what we're talking about right now. So with hormones, you see basically 3 stages. First is reception. In other words, you have some kind of a protein receptor. It picks up the signal. Transduction is sort of where the signal gets carried, amplified, and then the last step is going to be the response. In a lot of cases, this is going to be triggering the DNA, for example, to do something. All right, so this slide illustrates what I'm talking about. This is the main thing you need to know. You've got some kind of a receptor. In this case, it's in the membrane. It's not always in the membrane. We'll talk about that in a second. Transduction is where it gets amplified. Usually, this is what's going to happen is you're going to stimulate 1, which may stimulate 2, which may stimulate 4. It's going to, a lot of times, amplify the signal. And then the response is the cell's response to whatever's happened. In most cases, we're talking about, for example, the DNA is now triggered to make a particular protein. So that would be a good example of a response. All right, this is really important. If nothing else, know that there are 2 major classes of hormones. One is water-soluble. And this is where basically they can't go through the cell. Remember that the cell membrane is mostly hydrophobic, so these are going to be hydrophilic. So they're typically going to attach to a protein receptor that's on the membrane. Lipid-soluble molecules, the best example of this would be your steroid hormones, testosterone, estrogen, aldosterone. A lot of times they end in "-one". They're going to be the ones that are actually going to bind to receptors on the other side. They can actually go through the membrane. The receptor that they're looking for is inside. So that's a major difference between water-soluble and then lipid-soluble. And this is just showing one example of what's called a ligand. This one, it binds here, it causes this to open, and now something goes in and causes the response. So this is one example. A lot of times when it binds, it causes what are called second messengers to go into the cell, and that's sort of what that diagram was showing. The 2 most common ones are cyclic AMP. AMP actually stands for adenosine monophosphate, and another one is calcium ions. Calcium ions are actually very important in muscle contraction. And there's going to be a couple of diagrams coming up. These are just showing some examples. You will not have to know this, at least not right now. All of this stuff, this cascade of events that's happening, these are called protein kinases. All I really want you to know is that a signal binds to a receptor, and this is the amplification that leads to the response. The next diagram is a little bit different. This is a different kind of receptor. Again, it still leads to a cyclic AMP, which is a second messenger, and then here's our response. And I believe there's a third one here as well. Oh, and this last one, this is the lipid one I was talking about. Rather than the receptor being outside, in this case the receptor's inside, the receptor can now go with the hormone directly to the DNA, where the DNA now responds by producing some kind of a protein in response to that hormone. All right, and that's basically it. You do not have to know huge details. Just know the generalities of the different types of local versus long-distance signaling. Know that about lipid-soluble versus water-soluble hormones, and the 3 steps. That there's a binding, there's a transduction, and then there's a response. If you know that basic stuff from this section, you should be fine. Oh, and just a quick FYI, the yelling and screaming at the beginning of this recording was not someone getting beaten or tortured. It was the track team practicing in the hallway because it's raining outside, and the coach was strongly encouraging them to run fast. Just thought I'd throw that in there.